Hey guys, Adam here with AmericanMuscle.com. Today we're taking a look at and installing the SR Performance linear lowering springs fitting all 79 to 04 Mustang coupes, excluding 99 to 04 Cobra models. Now if you're the owner of that Fox Body SN95 or New Edge Mustang coupe, you might be in the market for a set of lowering springs. Now if you're looking for lowering springs, you already know that they'll give you that aggressive stance for your Mustang. Appearance is definitely a big factor when picking out a set of springs. Now I'll break down more in detail what linear versus progressive means when we take a look at this one compared to our progressive stock spring. Now if you're looking to get this linear spring for yourself, you can do so for just about 130 bucks on the site here. And again, there's a ton of different options, so you want to make sure you're choosing one that fits your preference. If you like the look of the 1.5 inch drop these SR springs have for your Mustang, I'm going to show you how to install it. So for the installation, it's going to get 2 out of 3 wrenches on our difficulty meter. It is a little bit more difficult than a direct bolt-on here, although it does not require any cutting and drilling. You're going to want to have the whole toolbox on deck, a variety of extensions, sockets, power drill, ratchets, wrenches, ratcheting wrenches, gloves of course, eye protection, I'd say a pry bar, and definitely a mallet or hammer to get the job done. One of your best friends going through into this install is going to be PB Blaster or WD-40 because this thing is a rust bucket. 20 to 23 years old and even more for the Fox Body owners out there. There's a lot of rust under here, which you can see in our frame, so our bolts are definitely going to be pretty bad. So I'm going to show you and walk through all the steps I took to fix all that stuff, and of course using a pry bar to pop in and out of our springs will definitely help. Some of these things actually broke off into our A-arms, so you'll see me tackle that as well. Now without further ado, I want to show you guys how this got installed, so expect about 3, maybe 4 hours if you're working on the floor. It's definitely going to take some time here, maybe a little bit more for you guys who might not have as much experience. Without further ado, let's see how this gets done. Tools needed for this install are power tool, ratchet, PB Blaster or WD-40, extension, 10mm ratcheting wrench, 10mm wrench, 14mm wrench, 15 to 17mm ratcheting swivel wrench, 15mm wrench, 18mm wrench, 15/16 wrench, flathead screwdriver, hammer, mallet, breaker bar, pry bar, blade, swivel joint socket, 10mm short socket, 15mm deep socket, 13mm deep socket, 15mm short socket, 18mm socket, 21mm socket, and 22mm socket, impact gun. All right guys, to kick off the uninstall, the first thing of course we need to do is pop all 4 wheels off in all 4 corners. I already broke the lug nuts loose. Make sure you have that key on deck if you have the keyed lug nuts. I already have that attached here, so I'm gonna grab my 22mm socket, pull the rest of the nuts off, grab our wheels out of the way, and we'll get to work. All right guys, once you get your wheels off, the first thing you want to do is to make sure you get your car in the air. If you're working on the ground, it can be a little bit easier to remove the top nut holding the shocks in from into the trunk liner. Now, if you are going to go that route, you want to make sure you're supporting the rear axle with jack stands on both sides. Support the weight because once you remove the top nut, the whole suspension is going to drop down and decompress the spring, which can be a little bit dangerous. Make sure you're supporting the rear axle before you do anything. We're working on a lift here today, so we got it up in the air, so our next step is to support it with pole jacks. If you're working on the floor with just an hydraulic jack, you want to have jack stands under both sides of the rear axle. You want to make sure you're putting pressure on it so that once you relieve the pressure off of your shocks, the rear axle doesn't drop down, decompressing your spring. That can be very, very dangerous. This is a very important step. So make sure you're using your pole jack or jack stands underneath the rear axle and putting pressure on it. All right, so before we remove any bolts, the first thing I want to use is our PB Blaster. WD-40 obviously works very well as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is lube up the bolt here on our brake line bracket. Now I want to remove this just because once I do start lowering down the rear axle, I don't want pressure to be put on the brake line. That can also be pretty dangerous. I'm going to lube up that bolt there. Then I'm going to put PB Blaster on the bolt and nut here on the bottom of our shock. Grab your 10mm socket and extension and remove the bolt here holding on the bracket for your brake line. Remove that clip there to get it out of place so it doesn't put pressure on it. All right, so I got my 15mm wrench here on the back side of the bolt, 18mm socket on the nut on the front. So this is the bottom of our shock here. This is exactly why you want to have the pole jack underneath the rear axle here. Once this is removed, all the pressure is going to drop down off of the spring and the rear axle, so this will come down. That's why you want to support that with your jack. Let's grab our mallet and knock this through. All right, since it's a solid rear axle, we're gonna do both sides simultaneously. So we have our bolt out of our shock on the driver's side. We're gonna do the same thing for the passenger. All right, so it's about that time. All we have to do now is lower down our pole jacks, or if you're using jack stands, you can do it that way, or an hydraulic jack if that's the route you're taking. So we're gonna lower down our pole jacks one at a time. Now this is very crucial to do it very cautiously. You wanna make sure you're going very slow because it's gonna start to decompress that spring. The spring is under a tremendous amount of load and pressure, so if you do it too quick, it can decompress and even shoot out and be very, very dangerous and cause injury. So we're gonna do one at a time, lowering it very slowly to decompress that spring until it's fully decompressed. Then we're gonna do it to the opposite side here, and we'll be able to remove both springs simultaneously. We got all the tension off of our rear springs here. You'll be able to tell because your jack only lowers so much and the rear axle will only go down so far. You'll be able to see that you can start to twist and turn. It's got a little bit of flex to the springs here. All I'm gonna do is hit it with some PB Blaster on the bottom and the top where the isolators meet. And simply because it is a 21-year-old car, it's a 97 Mustang, so these are factory parts, so it is pretty old. They've never been taken off before, so everything's a little rusty. I do expect maybe some of the springs to even break. Isolators are gonna be cracking and rusted, falling apart. So hit a little PB Blaster in there, then I'll grab a pry bar and start to pop them out of their sockets. If you're starting to have a little trouble getting your springs out, you can always raise the opposite end up a little more on the rear axle just to drop the one that you're working on a little bit lower. So that's what we're gonna do here. Then grab our pry bar again and try to get that spring out. We got our driver's side spring out in the rear. Now we have to work on our passenger side. So we're gonna raise up the driver's side axle, lower down our passenger side one to get that a little bit lower, decompress it some more, and pop it out. All right guys, so we finally got our factory spring off of the car and on the ground here, sitting next to our SR Performance linear lowering spring. Now there are two big points I want to point out here, the progressive versus linear and the ride height difference. So first off, ride height is something a little more obvious, right? You can take a look at these two springs and notice the difference in height. Now it does look like more than 1.5 inches on the ground here, but you want to keep in mind, once it's under load here, you're looking at about 1.5 inches drop in all four corners. There are other aftermarket springs out there that give you a staggered look, maybe 2-inch drop in the rear and 1.5 inches in the front, or whatever the differences may be. So if you're looking for a consistent all four corner equal drop, the SR Performance here gives you that 1.5 inch drop, which I think looks pretty good on the SN95 Mustangs. Now the second thing here I want to point out again is progressive versus linear spring rates. which we have the difference here. Now the SR Performance linear spring is to my left, and our stock spring here is a good example of a progressive spring rate. So I do want to just point out here that progressive springs are really going to give you the best of both worlds. You get that comfortable ride height under normal driving conditions, great for daily drivers, people just weekend warrior cars, going to car shows and just cruising around town. But for guys who want that drop in ride height and still want that sporty feel under hard loads, whether it be tight corners, if you're doing a lot of cornering there during some of the back roads, or if you're doing a lot of burnouts and drag launches and you just want that best of both worlds feel. Progressive is going to be the way to go. There's a ton of options out there in the aftermarket world. Now, if you're looking for something a lot more consistent, that has that sporty feel all the time, lets you know exactly how it's going to perform under every single driving condition, no matter what you're doing, whether it be the racetrack, the autocross course, or just, driving to work, the linear spring is going to be what you're looking for. This is typically race ready, great for guys out there who want to know exactly how it's going to perform every time with one defined spring rate. That's the linear spring, and that's what we're working on today. So without further ado, I want to get our 1.5 inch drop linear springs installed on our Mustang, so let's get to it. So we're pulling out our factory isolators here, and as you can see, they're a little beat up. The top one's a little mutilated. This bottom one is just completely ripped apart. So what we're going to do is actually completely replace these. Now they don't include these in the kit for the SR Performance linear lowering springs. You're going to have to pick these up separately, but they're pretty inexpensive on the site. It's a really good idea if you're working on a car that's upwards of 20, 21, 22 years old, like our SN95 here. So we're going to replace these isolators, put them on our springs, and throw it up in the vehicle. Put our new isolators on the top and bottom of our spring. The smaller pigtail side of our spring is actually going to be on the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and seat that into place. All right, so it might be a little easier for you guys to seat the isolator in place first. Otherwise, you can feed it over just like this. Make sure you're seating that isolator into the factory position here. Snap it into place. Get the spring to seat properly there. Once we put load on it, it'll start to seat a little more evenly on the bottom seat. All right, now we can pop off the opposite side's old factory isolators. Pop our new isolators into place. Put our spring in. With our new SR Performance lowering spring in place, what we need to do now is start to raise up our rear axle on both sides to get it to compress a little more, and we'll start to feed in the bottom of our rear shock into its place and bolt it down. Once we have it compressed a little bit more, everything will start to line up and we'll be good to move on to the front. Now that we have the bottom of our shock lined up with the factory mounting bracket, we can start to put our factory bolt straight through again, tighten it up with the nut. All right, at this point, take your 15mm wrench and your 18mm socket and tighten up the bottom shock bolt. Now we're here on the passenger side. We're gonna lift up this side of the axle, get our rear shock to line up through the bracket here, bolt it down, and move on to the front. I want to make a quick note here that you want to make sure both of your springs are coiled or facing the same general direction. Now, if you didn't make note of where your factory springs are sitting, the little pigtail at the bottom of your rear spring, I like to point right at the end of the rotor here, right where the gap is between your rotor and the wheel well. Right here is where that pigtail is going to sit, and you want to make sure the opposite side is facing that same direction, so they're not coiled in two different ways. The last thing we have to do after the bolts are replaced on the bottom of the shocks is bolt up the bracket holding on our brake line back into the hole on our frame. As we're wrapping up the rear here, I just want to make a quick point for you guys working on the ground and not on a lift like we are. Lift obviously makes things a lot easier. Pole jacks are easy to control to lower down our rear axle. But if you're working on the ground, you've probably got jack stands supporting your car at the pinch welds, which is a really good spot for them, or under the frame. And then of course, you want to have a hydraulic jack to be lowering and lifting your rear axle. Now, if you only have one hydraulic jack, you can just do it right under the pumpkin or the differential. That'll lower them both pretty evenly and you can work on them simultaneously. If you've got a couple of hydraulic jacks, I like to put one on each side to make your life a little bit easier there for decompressing and compressing the springs. Of course, you want to make sure you're putting that hydraulic jack on the axle itself, not under control arms or anything like that. Under the axle or under the differential is where you want to put it if you're working on the ground. Now, we're finished on the rear. We've got everything bolted back up. Let's move on to the front. The front end here has a couple more things you have to disconnect, but it's really not too difficult. If you're working on the ground, make sure you still have your jack stand supporting your vehicle under the pinch welds. Make sure you're using your hydraulic floor jack to support underneath of the A-arm. Put a little bit of pressure on there so once we disconnect all of our bolts, it doesn't decompress the spring all the way. Now, if you're using a lift like I am, a pull jack will do the exact same thing underneath of the A-arm. So the first thing we're going to disconnect is our brake line bracket, of course, so we're not putting pressure on it. Number 2 is the top nut on our sway bar end link. That'll disconnect the sway bar. And then there's 2 more bolts at the bottom of our strut tower, holding our strut to the assembly itself. So 3 things to disconnect there. First thing we're going to do is put our pull jack underneath the A-arm, then get to work on our bracket. All right, the first thing we're going to disconnect is the brake line bracket here. Bolt is on the other side. That'll come loose so we don't put pressure on it. Second thing we're going to disconnect is the top nut on our sway bar end link. That's going to disconnect our sway bar here, so we're going to do that. Third thing we're going to disconnect is the 2 bolts on the bottom of our strut here. So our strut comes down and connects to the hub assembly. We're going to remove those 2 bolts there. Now you're going to need both a socket and a wrench there to hold on from one side and disconnect it. The same thing for your sway bar end link. You're going to disconnect this nut at the top, but you're going to have to hold on to the one underneath here to keep it from spinning. All right, so we're going to put our pull jack right here underneath of our A-arm. There we go. So we're going to use our ratcheting wrench here at 10mm to remove the bolt holding on our brake line bracket. This might be a little rusty, so you might want to hit it with some PB Blaster and give it some good old elbow grease. Now we're going to put our 18mm socket on the bolt underneath here, our sway bar end link, and we're going to use our 14mm wrench to remove our top nut. All right guys, when it comes time to take the bolts out of your strut on the front end here, we're working on the driver's side, you're going to want to use a lot of PB Blaster or WD-40 since it is upwards of 20 to 22 years old here. The bolts are factory, they've never been removed, so it is going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. If you're having that much trouble after hitting it with the PB Blaster, you can always use a breaker bar like I did. This makes life a lot easier, gives you a lot more leverage, you can put more strength on it. Once the nut's out of place, the bolts might be a little too tough to get out by hand, so you might need a hammer to knock them out of place. And then if it doesn't actually fully come out, you can actually remove some of the tension from the pull jack or jack stand underneath the car. That way it can kind of play with the threading there and it'll actually allow you to pull the bolt out. I'm going to release some of the tension by pulling this pull jack up a little more. That way the bolts will come out a little easier. It's about time we lower down the pull jack to take that compression off of our front spring here. Make sure you're doing this with caution, just like the rear. It can be very dangerous if you do it too quickly. Just want to make sure you decompress that spring with ease and go very slowly. So let's get to it. You'll start to see your sway bar end link coming out of the sway bar there. So the fronts were a lot harder to get out than the rears. They were pretty stubborn and pretty much rusted to the A-arm here. So what you're gonna need to do is use a lot of PB Blaster, WD-40, and a pry bar that's pretty lengthy to give yourself some leverage to pop that out of place and stand out of the way so it doesn't pop right out and shoot at you. So just be smart and be cautious when you're trying to get the front springs out. Now what we're gonna do is take a flathead screwdriver and just scrape along the bottom of this A-arm to scrape some of that rust out, clean it out, and then pop our new SR springs in. To assemble our isolators, onto our spring here. Obviously the flat one goes over top of the flattened coil. That's gonna be the top of your spring. We're gonna flip this over, and this is gonna be a little bit more difficult. So we've got this tubing isolator that's gonna have to go all the way around the coil. So you're gonna wrap this around so it's wrapped around that coil there. So what I'm gonna do is take our PB Blaster, I'm gonna lube up real good the inside of this tubing, and then I'm gonna lube up the coil here, so hopefully it'll slip right on. So if it gives us any trouble, we'll use our mallet to knock things in, but for now, let's lube it up and get to work. So we're having a little trouble getting our isolator tube over the spring coil simply because the beginning of this coil here is a little too narrow for the thickness of this tubing, so we can't actually feed it over. So what I'm going to do is use my knife for is to cut this down the middle. I'm going to feed it over and wrap it around the coil itself. So let's go ahead and get that started. Time we put our spring into place with the isolators, go top first. All right, we got our spring back in place. We've jacked it up enough to put pressure on the spring to compress it a bit. What we want to do is jack everything up so that our caliper and hub assembly lines up with the open holes on our lower strut. So what we're going to do is make sure it's jacked up properly, line it up, feed this bracket in through the open slot here, put the bolts through and tighten them down. We'll finish it up by putting our sway bar end link back in place and then our brake line bracket. All right, now we can put our 15/16 inch wrench over top of the nuts on the inside, and then of course use our 21mm socket to tighten them down from the opposite side. All right, so now we're gonna put our sway bar end link through. We're gonna put our spacer in first, rubber isolator in second. That's going to sit up against our sway bar. Now we're going to put our rubber spacer, cap it off with a nut. All right, now we can bolt back down our brake line bracket. All right guys, we're starting on our final corner here of our 97 Mustang. The first things first, pole jack or jack stands or hydraulic floor jack goes underneath of our A-arm here to support the weight of our spring, so when we decompress it, it's safe. So what we're gonna do is start off by using a 10mm ratcheting wrench to remove the bolt holding on our brake line bracket. Then we're gonna move into the sway bar end link again, finish things off with the 2 bolts holding on our strut to the hub assembly, and then we'll be able to decompress the spring, pop it out, replace it, put it back together. First things first, the 10mm ratcheting wrench on our brake line bracket. All right, next up, we're using a 15mm wrench and socket on the bottom to remove our sway bar end link. So I've got my 21mm socket, my 15/16 wrench holding on the nut from the other side. I'm gonna remove the bolts on the bottom of the strut. All right, now we can use our hammer to knock these bolts out. All right guys, it's about time we lower down this jack cautiously. Now remember, this is gonna be a really dangerous part and it has potential to cause some serious injury. You wanna make sure that you're slowly lowering your jack down to decompress the spring. I know I've made that point with all of the other 3 corners that we've done so far, but it's really important that you guys do this very slowly, cautiously, making sure that it's decompressing enough that it's not gonna shoot out of its seat. So what we're gonna do is rotate our pull jack here. If you're using a hydraulic jack, make sure you're twisting that arm slowly to get it on the ground. About the time we put in our last SR Performance linear lowering spring. We're gonna put it in here to our A-arm, get it seated properly, start raising up our pull jack to meet it up a little bit more, put a little tension on it. We'll put in a new sway bar end link since the old one was a little worse for wear. And we're also gonna put in our brake line bracket bolt and then of course finish it off with the bolts in our strut. So let's get to it. All right, we got our spring seated here. All we have to do now is put the jack underneath of it, jack it up a little bit to put some tension in, and we can start reconnecting our pieces. At this point, we got our spring seated. I used a pry bar to get it to seat properly. You just push up on it, it pops back into place. We're gonna, at this point, replace our sway bar end link. Now, this is the old one, here's our new one. The old one's got some, worn out bushings going on here. They're not gonna see a whole lot more life, and it's also rusted to all hell. So what we're gonna do is just completely replace this. This is good to go. All we gotta do is unbolt the top of this, slip it into place, bolt it back down with our bushings in the correct order. At this point, all we have to do is line up our hub to the holes in our strut here and put our bolt through them. Now, in order to do so, we might have to start jacking this up a little bit just to get it to line up properly, but let's get to it. All right, now last step here is to put back our brake line bracket right into the hole here. We can thread it by hand and then work on it with our ratchet. Well, that's going to wrap up my review and install walkthrough of the SR Performance linear lowering springs. Now, we detailed the difference between the linear and progressive options, both of which you can find for SR Performance on our site here for approximately the same price of about $130. If you're looking for the SR lowering springs with the linear spring rate, you can get yours right here at AmericanMuscle.com.